In 1989, the winds of revolutionary change began to sweep over the communist world, ultimately toppling nearly every regime in Eastern Europe. The end of the Soviet bloc was followed by the end of the Soviet Union itself, not long after the failure of the hardline coup launched in August of 1991. Communist regimes continued to rule in Vietnam, North Korea, and most notably China. But closest to home, there remains, of course, Fidel Castro's Cuba. After the disintegration of the socialist camp, which provided Cuba with 85% of its trade under unusually generous terms, the Cuban economy finds itself approaching a state of near total collapse. Everyone, regardless of political outlook, agrees that this is one of the worst crises Castro has faced during his 33 years in power. Yet, debates continue to rage over what is likely to happen in Cuba, what should happen, and most specifically, over what the United States should do about Fidel Castro's government. Most recently, radically different perspectives over Cuba were made manifest in New York City. A rally sponsored by the Peace for Cuba appeal and attended by over 3,000 people was held at the Jacob Javits Center in order to call, among other things, for an end to the U.S. economic embargo of the island. At the same time, approximately 40,000 people marched outside the Javits Center to protest the aims of the rally and to call for a tightening of economic sanctions against the Castro regime. Hello, I'm Rafael Piroman, and welcome once again to Visiones. Today we'll be discussing the many grave problems and various possibilities confronting Fidel Castro's Cuba. Joining us in this discussion and debate are Teresa Gutierrez of the International Peace for Cuba appeal, Jose Prince of the Christian Democratic Party of Cuba, Miguel Perez, editor and publisher of the Latino News, and Samuel Farber, professor of political science at Brooklyn College. Welcome to the show, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. Teresa, you were one of the organizers for of the Peace for Cuba rally that was held at the Jacob Javits Center on January 25th. What was the purpose, the goal that you had in mind when that rally was organized?
The goal of carrying out this activity January 25th, I could summarize as two. One is that Cuba faces the most serious crisis that this country has ever faced. It is facing a very serious possibility that the U.S. government may intervene militarily into that country. It is facing a very serious economic crisis due to the many changes in the international political situation. Second of all, to expose the many lies that the U.S. government has propped up to carry out and support its campaign of hostility against Cuba for over 30 years, we organized this activity to call for peace for Cuba, to address this crisis. We believe that now is the time to end the 30-year economic blockade that the U.S. government has carried out against Cuba, and that the only people who will really be able to deal with this situation, to put an end to the economic blockade, to stop U.S. military or economic intervention in Cuba, is the people of this country.
Miguel, you were one of the organizers of the Freedom March that was going on outside of the Peace for Cuba rally. What were the goals that you had in mind?
We also want to appeal to the American people, but with the truth about what really is going on in Cuba. At a time when Eastern Europe is enjoying democracy, at a time when communism has disintegrated in the Soviet Union, it is an insult to our intelligence in this country where we enjoy such freedoms to see people still demonstrating to put up the Berlin Wall all over again, which is what these people wanted to do at the Jacob Javits Center, supporting a 33-year Stalinist regime 90 miles away from the United States. President Bush may think that the Cold War is over, but Castro still doesn't think so, and the Cuban people are still suffering the grip of communism. It was a question of honor. It was a question of principle when we found out that the few communists still left in this world, were about to insult the intelligence of the American public. It was our responsibility as freedom-loving Cubans and North Americans and many other Latinos who were out there marching, 40,000 to 3,000 inside the center, 40,000 outside in the cold of zero weather. Why? From all over the country. Why? Because it was time to let the world know that 90 miles away there's still communism.
Okay, let me, Jose, your organization didn't participate in either event. What's your position on those very different events?
Well, we are for peace in Cuba, but we believe that to have peace in Cuba, there is a need for a democratization process. There can be no peace in Cuba until there is the right of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and all the different human rights. Now, we believe that the group that organized it probably have the best intentions, but I think that the same way they're asking the U.S. government to evaluate its policies toward Cuba, we believe that they should also ask the question, the same kind of question to the Cuban government, and to evaluate the policies.
A lot of the, if not every organizer of the march outside was calling for a tightening of the embargo against Cuba. Are you for that? Or are you linking the end of the embargo with the democratization of Cuba?
Well, that's one of the reasons that we did not join the Freedom March outside as an organization. Many join as individuals. But we do not support the embargo or to make it even more stronger. Now, that's a difference of a strategy. Basically, there are two basic ideas of how change could take place in Cuba. One is by closing all the doors and by making the situation explode, and we don't favor that strategy. We favor the opening, and that's why we believe that the embargo is, first, is being paid, is being suffered by the Cuban people, not by the Cuban government. Second, we believe that the way to bring democratization, peace, freedom to Cuba is through communication, is through having all kind of relation, is opening, making spaces inside Cuba for freedom and democracy and peace. And that's why we feel that there's an alternative to those, any kind of violent strategy, as well as a unilateral call to the U.S. government to change policies.
Right. Someone, where do you fall on this?
Well, what I would like to speak about is the fact that we cannot isolate the Cuban situation from the rest of the world. And the fact is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the military and political supremacy of the United States is totally unchallenged, as reflected in the war in the Gulf, where I don't even call it a war, that was a massacre really, and where the United States once again, in my opinion, quite hypocritically, took the stance of defending freedom and democracy while it had been Hussein's friend till the day before yesterday. So I am concerned that the supremacy, political and military supremacy of the United States is not used once again as it happened at the end of the 19th century, where the Cuban people had very legitimate and grievances and very strong grievances against the Spanish Empire and carried out the struggle, and then that struggle was appropriated by the U.S. and Cuba came under control of the U.S. I am for democratization in Cuba. I am for a democratic and hopefully socialist and humane system in Cuba. I am not, and therefore from that point of view I think the regime must be opposed in Cuba. I am not, however, for that becoming an excuse for the United States to use its current triumphalism, that is the boss of the world, to reassert its control over Cuba.
Miguel, how about that? I mean, isn't there a hypocrisy in
Nobody's
the U.S.
asking the
government?
United States to intervene anywhere. Cubans want the right to free their country by themselves. Cubans here want the opportunity to go to Cuba and liberate our own country.
3 men would not have entered Cuba
let me finish.
had they not known.
It is the State Department that keeps, the State Department of the United States government that keeps Fidel Castro in power by forbidding Cubans like myself to go back, from going back to fight for our own country.
But isn't the maintaining of an embargo, in fact, an act of aggression, as some people would call it, by the part of the, and kind of a double standard, since they have the exact opposite policy towards China?
Why do we call it an act of aggression when it is against Cuba and not against South Africa, I wonder? Why do the same liberals of this country want an embargo against South Africa and not against Cuba? The embargo against Cuba should be maintained because it's the only way to strangle the Castro regime. Mr. Prince mentioned about talked about the fact that he favors an opening. What he favors is what we in the Cuban community call a dialogue with Castro. You cannot dialogue with an assassin. It's been tried in the past, and it was a monologue. Right. It was not a dialogue.
All right, Teresa, we have to, hold on, we have to take a break, and when we come back, we'll go to you, Teresa, because I know you wanted to say something.
I would like to comment on the blockade.
We need a break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
My wife and children are hostage in Cuba. The pressure, the humiliation that they are suffering now is inhuman.
There is a place where kids can go to help them grow. A place that keeps them sheltered from the streets. A place where they can learn the skills they need in life. In love. How to succeed. It is the Boys and Girls Club, a place of care. Think what would happen if it wasn't there.
Support your local club.
For 2 weeks every summer, the Fresh Air Fund sends city kids to the country. Help make it happen for other city kids. Give to the Fresh Air Fund, because we all have enough to share.
Dial a Mattress. For over 10 years, the easiest way to buy a brand new mattress without leaving home. Just pick up the phone and dial 1-800-MATTRES. You'll get the lowest prices on Sealy Posturepedic, Serta Perfect Sleeper, and Simmons Beauty Rest. You'll get express 2-hour delivery. That's right, 2-hour delivery, and you only pay our driver upon your approval. Dial 1-800-MATTRES and leave off the last S for savings.
Welcome back. Today we're discussing the problems that Cuba is facing and possible alternatives to the problems. Teresa, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to say that you cannot discuss any policy by the U.S. on Cuba without talking about the role of the U.S. government. How can you have a policy where a 30-year blockade has been carried out? How is it that Brazil cannot trade or even have an air link with Cuba? How is it that 3 men feel the courage or feel the strength to enter Cuba with arms, many, many arms, to carry out sabotage and violence in Cuba, if it wasn't for the fact that this government is fully behind?
But you're not saying that the fact, hold on, Miguel, but you're not saying that the fact that 3 men were willing to go to Cuba is a demonstration that the United States is...
It's a deep and serious example of how the U.S. government in these last few months is strengthening a political atmosphere where the most rabid reactionary elements in this country feel the courage to go into Cuba to carry out sabotage. But I want to finish one point. I just want to finish the point about democracy. I do want to finish that one point.
Briefly, please, because
the reason why is because the reason why the U.S. government has been able to maintain the blockade and all its other policies against Cuba is because it has carried out a campaign of misinformation. I believe that the Cuban people have made their choice on their leadership. They have made their choice.
Okay, so wait a minute. Okay, you want to say something, and I want to ask you...
Yeah, there was a...
We'll go to you.
Miguel referred earlier to the comparison between Cuba and South Africa, and I don't think it's a valid comparison because there is a history here about United States control over Cuba. Now, it seems to me that we need a movement against a blockade in Cuba. However, and here's what I disagree with you, it has to be a movement that very clearly states that it's not apologizing for the Cuban regime, that it will condemn an execution of when the situation where there was no bloodshed by any standards of jurisprudence, justice, of any kind of criteria that we could use, that execution had
You're
to be
talking about
condemned.
the individual who was one of the three that Teresa mentioned who was executed.
No, no,
Right.
yeah, but
I'm referring to that. Wait a minute. Let me
Let
So it seems to me that a movement for non-intervention in Cuba, so the Cuban people themselves can settle the problem, cannot be confused with a movement that apologizes to the regime in Cuba.
Okay,
and
right, but
those two things must be separated very
But
clearly.
Miguel has a point, doesn't he have a point when he says, if you are for changing the regime, many of the people who opposed the embargo in Cuba supported South Africa, regardless of the different contexts, supported the economic measures against Chile, which apparently worked, and against Nicaragua, isn't it?
I am not against embargoes in general as an abstract proposition. In each specific case, we have to look at the history of the actors involved. What are the contexts that are involved in the situation?
Okay.
I think each case has to be looked, and in this case, we have a situation where Cuba has always been under the control of one power or another. I think the end of the 20th century, just a minute, I didn't interrupt you. You know, I think the end of the 20th century is enough time so Cuba can be truly independent.
Okay, Jose.
Okay, let me go back to Miguel's point. Our real policy of the Christian Democratic Party and many other groups, including the Democratic Platform, which include conservative, liberal, social democrats, Christian Democrats, is that we have opted for a non-violent strategy to bring democratization and freedom to Cuba and peace. And now that means, and I'm not going to ever, go away from your point, that means that the same way that in Poland and in most other communist countries in Europe, the opening to democracy and freedom took place through negotiations. Yes, we are willing to sit down and negotiate with those in Cuba, not only with Fidel Castro. We are not talking about a dialogue with Fidel Castro, as you mentioned, Miguel. That's the wrong way to present the issue. We are saying that we want a political negotiation. We are willing to have...
With who?
With the opposition inside Cuba and those within the government that see that the country is going toward a crisis,
Okay,
it's going toward a disaster.
Miguel, okay, let me...
Mr. Prince represents a group, and I have to clarify this. The groups that he stated, first of all, Rafael, when you introduced me, you said that I was one of the organizers. I'm simply a Cuban who is, I believe, among the large majority of Cuban Americans in this country who supported what 29 anti-Castro Cuban organizations in this country organized together. All 29 of those organizations are against the embargo. Let's make that very clear. Now,
that doesn't mean that the majority of the Cubans.
what Mr. Prince does is he goes back and forth to Cuba, and he negotiates, and he visits Cuba everywhere so often. And I would remind them of what our hero of the Cuban independence told us 100 years ago.
We got to take a break.
Jose Marti told us that to visit the home of the oppressor is to sanction the oppressor.
Okay,
that's what he does. That's what he does.
With the glorious words of Jose Marti, we close this segment, and we'll be right back after these messages. Stay with us.
This is an aggressive and hostile policy, trying to asphyxiate Cuba economically in order to change the government in Cuba.
Time really does a number on your car. At Mako, we're ready to do a number on your car, too. But this number you'll like, half. We're only half price. A great Mako paint job. Now during our
Mako half-price paint sale. Right now, come to your local Mako Center and get a $399.95 Mako Supreme paint job for only $199.95. That's just half price.
So come on in. For half price, we'll paint the whole car.
Children need families. When Terry adopted a special needs child, she knew it meant a lot of work.
Each person measure of a lot of work is different. It all depends on the commitment you've made. I've made a commitment to myself and these children. So whatever it takes to make them as normal as possible, that's what I'm willing to do. You know, so it's paid off. It's worth it.
The religious community joins with Channel 4 to celebrate everyone's right to religious freedom in America. Jesus tells us to tend to little children, feed the hungry, and visit the imprisoned. As a small child in Sunday school, my teacher told me, I can tell you what I believe and what the church believes, but you must decide what you will believe. Religious freedom is an open door. Ask a child to think, question, hope, and pray today, and we will live in a city closer to the kingdom of God tomorrow.
My students and I are identifying plants and trees today. Of course, out here, I'm concerned about tick bites that may cause Lyme disease, so we've taken some precautions. The tick is very small, but you can usually see it if you know what to look for. This New Jersey Department of Health pamphlet about Lyme disease explains it all. After all, we don't want to avoid the outdoors, just the ticks.
This is Governor Jim Florio. Call our hotline for this free pamphlet on Lyme disease.
Welcome back. Jose, you wanted to respond to some things Miguel said.
Yes. First, yes, I have been back to Cuba. And as Jose Marti did it, I went back to Cuba because it's my country and because I believe that the opposition to Castro, I'm in the opposition to Castro, should find the best way for the Cuban people. And it's really for those inside Cuba to make the major decision, not any one of us which is outside. And most Cuban inside will tell you that they don't want any more bloodshed, that they don't want any more U.S. intervention or any Russian intervention. They want the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to associate, and the chance to have a plebiscite. Castro has been for 33 years without any kind of election, real election.
Can I respond to that?
Well, you can respond to that, or you can respond to this question, which I want to ask all of you. What is the most critical thing that people viewing this show can do, from your point of view, to help Cuba find the freedom and the peace that all of you really are searching for in different ways?
Well, the American people have to realize that there is a Stalinist regime, 33 years old, when these people
and do what?
that organize. Well, be aware that what we were trying to do with our march and our rally is make the American people aware of what is still going on, so that they can apply pressure on the U.S. government to help us in our cause. These people talk about self-determination.
Right,
33 years ago, self-determination.
I got to give everybody a right to say the same.
My answer is, whether you're a soft cop or whether you're a hard cop, you're going along with the same objectives of Bush's program, and that's to return Cuba back to the days before 1959. They want to see the banks and the corporations go in there and lay off people and open up the prostitution houses and the gambling houses just before 1959. The people of this country have to end the blockade.
I got to give Sam his time. Please, we're running out of time.
Okay. There is a Stalinist regime in Cuba. I agree that much with you. However, I don't want that Stalinist regime to be replaced by American domination of Cuba. I want the Cuban people to take control of their affairs, and it's certainly not the case that the majority of the right-wing exiles who were at the demonstration, they are for the restoration of American control in Cuba.
Okay.
You know.
Absurd.
I don't want any kind of
absurd.
U.S. intervention, military or economic. That's why I'm opposing the embargo. At the same time, I do believe that there is a dictatorship that has to open up, and it's the Cuban people, inside and outside, the one that should determine what is best for them.
Okay.
Rafael, these people that organized this thing inside Jacob Javits, most of them were not even Cuban. They're not even Cuban. Peace. They talk about peace for Cuba. Cuba has not been at war for more than 30 years. The only war Cubans have known is the one that Castro exported to Latin America and to Africa. What peace? What peace are they talking about? 33 years of a dictatorship. They say they want peace. They're afraid of a blockade that doesn't exist. They keep calling it a blockade. What blockade?
Can you travel? Can you spend money? Can you send medicine?
You can travel. You go to Cuba. You're a spy that goes back to Cuba all the time, and everyone knows it.
The traveling is also limited by the Cuban government. A U.S. citizen cannot leave.
Miguel, please, you've got to give these people time to
the U.S. government. It's time to spend money here at home instead of supporting a blockade.
The Cuban government doesn't allow the Cuban citizen to leave or enter the country. The Cuban government is part of the blockade, is part of the isolation.
Miguel, hold on. You raised the question earlier about what should American people do. And I think it's two things that American people can do. Number one, to insist that the blockade be removed so the Cuban people can make their own decisions without external pressure.
You're going to have to give people a chance to talk.
Because otherwise, that's a democracy you're going to establish in Cuba when you don't have anybody else speak. And number two, I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that. But you want to replace one where you don't let me speak either. And the other thing that we can do is for the American people to support human rights organizations, independent human rights organizations that denounce abuses of human rights in Cuba.
Well, with that, we're going to have to close. I'm sorry, everybody. Please, we got one more segment to say goodbye. Please come back, and we'll say goodbye.
We don't want to see the regime have oxygen that's necessary to maintain a dictatorship. We'd like to see it have the oxygen that a democratic country can have.
Dial a Mattress. For over 10 years, the easiest way to buy a brand new mattress without leaving home. Just pick up the phone and dial 1-800-MATTRES. You'll get the lowest prices on Sealy Posturepedic, Certa Perfect Sleeper, and Simmons Beauty Rest. You'll get express 2-hour delivery. That's right, 2-hour delivery, and you only pay our driver upon your approval. Dial 1-800-MATTRES and leave off the last S for savings.
The doctor just told you your child has leukemia. Suddenly the whole world changes. Dramatic progress has been made thanks to research funded by the Leukemia Society, and lives that once were without hope are slowly being turned around. Please call the Leukemia Society, because when there's help, there's hope.
The religious community joins with Channel 4 to celebrate everyone's right to religious freedom in America. It is a right which must be zealously preserved and perpetuated if we are to be a nation under God. We Orthodox Christians throughout the centuries have fought for religious freedom and will continue to do so whenever religious freedom is undermined, attacked, or abused.
Okay, well, it did turn out to be a debate rather than a discussion, but I'm very glad you guys are here. Thank you very much for coming. For Visiones, I'm Rafael Pirroman. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.
Why are they so hostile to Cuba? Because in 1959, the Cubans, by themselves, with no one's permission, overthrew a totally despotic dictator in 1959.